Hi, everybody. I'm Edie Stern, the webmaster for fanic.org. And today we are fortunate to have Joe Green with us to tell us about his admirable career in science fiction. Joe has been a friend of mine for close to 40 years, if not 40 years. And he has had an amazing trajectory, starting with his Spanish experiences in the 1950s, moving to having his first published stories in the 1960s. And I think his last published story was about a week ago. Very, very long writing career, to a decades-long career with NASA, where he at one point was the only person listed as a writer on the Kennedy Space Center books, and had the difficult job of editing the report on Challenger, to his career as just a lovely Southern gentleman, very hospitable to fans from all over that were wanting to be anywhere close to a launch. So welcome, Joe. Thank you for joining us today, and happy birthday. I hear you just turned 93.
That is correct. Just turned 93.
So I'm going to take my face off the screen because no one needs to look at me. Joe, why don't we start out by telling us how you got into this? How did you find science fiction?
Well, that was an odd thing. I grew up in a little town of less than 500 people. And somewhere around the age of 11 or 12, I discovered a type of literature that I much enjoyed more than any other. And I had no idea that it was called science fiction and fantasy, but I enjoyed it. I read it. And in the back of one of those magazines, in the reader column, I saw a letter, believe it or not, from someone who lived only 50 miles from me. His name was Shelby Vick. And I decided to write to him, and I did, and we got in communication. And then I drove the 50 miles and met him, and we became lifelong friends. He died just a few years ago. That's how I got started in fandom.
But you'd been reading science fiction before that, right?
I had been reading science fiction and fantasy, not knowing that they were an identifiable genre. I just read them because I enjoyed them. I read books about many authors, but the ones I liked the most were those that turned out to be written by people like Heinlein and other older people, Asimov, Clarke, etc., who were already writing by the time I was 12. I better not name those guys in particular and make them as old as I am. But in any case, it boiled down to the fact that I had no idea that there was a specific category called science fiction or fantasy. I just read them because I liked them. And that is how I got in touch with other fans at about somewhere around 15 or 16. In my little hometown, there were not many readers, not many people who actually cared that much about reading. And I was one of a very small group. When you grow up in a little southern town of under 500, there aren't that many people around to communicate with.
Yeah, I can understand that. As I put fanzines online and put up some of the early fanzines from the 50s, I've noticed that you've got some stories, some articles in those early fanzines. How did you get involved in the active part of fandom?
Well, after we became adults and I moved to Panama City and was living near Shelby and also married at that point, I married at age 20. Shelby and I decided to put out a fanzine. We were both we were both fans of the literature, and we decided we would do a fanzine. However, when we got into the actual production of it, Shelby wanted to do some physical labor that would require a great deal of time, and I wanted to do everything with machines as mechanical as possible. I've always been inclined that way. The heck with doing manual labor. And so we came to a disagreement. The specific activity was Shelby wanted to have a feature called It's in the Bag, which meant we would physically paste a small paper bag in the back of every copy. And then we would insert into that bag a special written something or the other. And I just basically revolted at the idea of doing all that hand labor. And so Shelby and I had a disagreement, and then we came to an agreement. He would become the sole editor, and I would become a columnist. And that's where it actually wound up. The fanzine was Confusion, and it lasted about 10 or 12 issues before Shelby also grew tired of all that work and stopped it. But in the interval, I became the a columnist running the portrait column. And since I got very few contributions to the portrait column, I just wrote them all myself and put 100 different pseudonyms on them. And we published it that way until, as I say, Shelby himself tired of all that labor and stopped it. I don't remember exactly how many copies of Confusion came out, but
Well, Joe, at some point you're going to have to tell us some of those pseudonyms.
I'd have to go look them up. I do have copies of Confusion. You may remember that I sent all my extra fanzines and so forth to you and Joe some time ago, but I kept the Confusions. Anyway, it's not that important. They were just very minor poems that appeared in a very minor fanzine and faded swiftly away.
So did that stimulate your desire to become a professional?
It did indeed. In regard to that, sometime after Shelby and I, basically, as I say, I became a columnist, which didn't take all my time. And at the age of 20 or 21, I sincerely wanted to become a professional writer. To me, that was more important than being a fan. So I cut back on the fanish activity and devoted myself primarily to trying to become a professional writer. And guess what? It wasn't easy. I spent years and years of effort before I finally sold a short story. I wrote and sent off my first short story at the age of 15. It was a single line printed on both sides. Paper was expensive. I didn't have any money. And sent that first story off. And would you believe I got back notes from editors commenting on the story? Nobody bought it, but they commented on it. And I only learned later how unusual that was. And looking back, I think what happened was those editors recognized this is a very young fellow here, and maybe he needs to be encouraged. And so they sent me notes, to my surprise. But nevertheless, it took years later before I sold my first story at age 30, 15 years after I wrote that first. And incidentally, the most interesting thing, I sold 2 stories within a week. Once I first, and that would be in 1961. I sold 2 stories in the first week of my career. And then went on from there, of course, to write many more.
Well, before we get into your professional career, let's talk some more about your fanish career in the 50s. You mentioned Shelby Vick.
Yes, Shelby Vick became a long-time friend, and it was one until he died. I also met Harry Moore, who was the chairman of one of the World Cons, and Harry became a lifelong friend until he died. I'm sorry to talk so much about people dying, but I've outlived all my friends. And Harry and I became friends, and he lived in New Orleans. When returning from the convention in Canada, he swung by Cottondale, Florida, where I lived, and picked me up. And I went to New York with him my first time to a large city. And then, as I say, stayed with Harry for a few days, came home, and he and I became lifelong friends and stayed that way. As for other Southern fans, I knew a few, but those were the only 2 real friends with lasting friendships. The others were, let us say, more casual acquaintances. Oh, I did go to you mentioned FANAC and so forth, professionalism. I went to the World Con in Chicago in 1952 with Shelby and with 4 fans from Atlanta. And it was my first convention. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I met a lot of authors, and I stood within 10 feet of Theodore Sturgeon, the man I adored above all others as a writer. And I didn't have the nerve to go and introduce myself. Met him later, but not then. And I had a great time and became a devotee of conventions. Unfortunately, because they're very expensive, I didn't get to go to many until much later in life when I acquired I got a better job and could afford to go. My FANAC activity from that 1952 convention to the time I sold the first 2 stories was limited because I just didn't have the time. I had a wife and 2 children to support. My wife was not working at the time with 2 young children at home. We didn't want her working. And so I needed to I was the sole breadwinner, and I wanted to take care of my family as any man would. And so I did not I did a minimum fan activity, basically contributing articles here and there to fans.
Okay, did you, any other comments on those early conventions? You've been to conventions in the 80s and 90s and later decades, but anything special that you remember about those early days?
On to that first major World Con, And then for the next several years, I was either too busy or too financially strapped to go. And I returned to going to conventions in the 60s and went to a great many for a really good reason. I learned that you could take off the expenses of going to conventions from your writing income, dollar to dollar. And that was one of the very few things that is perfectly legal to do that I enjoyed thoroughly. And my wife, Juanita at the time, also enjoyed. Not couldn't take her expenses off, but I could mine. One of the few things you can do that is both enjoyable and tax deductible. And so I went to a lot of conventions throughout the 60s and 70s and some in the 80s. So I started cutting back by then because it was I could deduct it from my tax, my writing income, and lower my taxes, which were pretty horrendous. You have a full-time job and you get your tax deductions on the job, and income from writing is basically taxed at a high level. And I was paying a very high rate of taxation based on the writing income alone. So I spent it in a way that benefited me and enjoyable and was legal to do so.
And that's good because as a writer, the connections that you made at those conventions must have been very valuable.
They were indeed. The connections I made at the conventions and so forth not only were tax deductible, but I met a lot of new people there whose company I enjoyed, editors, writers, artists. And I became a convention fan. And in the 60s and 70s, I went to, I don't know how many, but all over the country, lots and lots, several world cons, and several, let's say, more local conventions. I enjoyed them all, had a great time. And so did the people who went with me at those conventions. Anyway, that became my primary activity by which I contacted fans because, as I said earlier, my activity in fandom was limited because I simply didn't have time to raise a family, raise two children. I wound up with 2 wives, 2 children with each, and raised them all. And between that and working a full-time job, my free time was limited. And so I wound up going to conventions, as I said, and raising family and earning a decent living. But my fan activity was a minimum because that just wasn't time in one's life to do it all.
Were there any connections that you made at those 60s and 70s conventions that are particularly worth mentioning?
No, I can't think of any. I met several editors, but I'd already met them through correspondence. And so I can't say that it meant that much to my career. I don't really look back and see any direct connection I ever made at a convention that led to anything specific that was greatly in my favor of as a professional writer. The work stands on its own. When you write a story, it becomes its own entity. And then no matter how much some editor may like you personally, if the story isn't good, he's not going to buy it. And if he's never met you and it's a good story, he will buy it. So it wasn't that important.
Okay. So do you think that, did fandom help you in your professional aspirations, or did it hinder you?
Well, actually, if I had turned heavily to fandom in the 1950s, when I was attempting to become a professional writer, I think it would have limited me. As I said, time when you are a busy man with a family and a job, your free time is very, very precious. And I had to make a choice between how much I wanted to devote to fandom, how much I wanted to devote to professional writing. And I gave writing the priority. So I have to say that I made a conscious decision that trying to become a professional writer would occupy my free time. And so I did very little fan activity in those years, other than occasional contributions to fanzines.
So one of the your day job, I know that you didn't go full-time as a writer at that point, and I know that you have always focused on the engineering and space sectors. Can you tell us about your experiences with in those early days? Particularly, I know you were involved with the military space program. So can you tell us about that?
In my blurb above on my page on Amazon, it says I have 6 years experience in the military and 31 in civilian space program. I didn't talk much about the military side because at the time I did it, it was very, very secret. And blabbing about it would have gotten you a swift visit by the FBI. But now, the years have passed, times have changed, and I think I'm free to talk about it. Yeah, in the military space program, I worked for 2.5 years on the Beaumont program, which is now forgotten. Then 2.5 years on the Minuteman program, which is still out there, still extant. It is the USA's #1 land-based defense force, or I call it defense force. Of course, it can be otherwise. Anyway, I worked for Boeing at the time. And one of the things I'm proud of is that I was the supervisor for the crew that installed the checkout and launch equipment for the first launch control center for the first 10 Minuteman missiles. That was at Maelstrom AFB, Montana. That was about, we had all the equipment installed, my crew, and I had all the equipment installed, and I left that site about 2 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the next 10 missiles in the Launch Control Center that would send them on their way, and the next 10 after that and so forth are right behind mine. So while I have no actual evidence to prove it, I am fairly sure that by the time the Cuban Missile Crisis came along, it lasted 13 days, according to some research I did quite recently. My 10 were online and ready with a load of atomic bombs ready to go. And I suspect that the next 10 and the next 10 were also ready, and maybe the next third or fourth. I have no way of knowing precisely how many. I do know they came online right behind mine, and so I know they were ready. And one thing I would bet you is that Khrushchev knew it. I bet his spies were able to tell him that, yes, those first 30, 40 Minutemen are online. They've got 40 atomic bombs, and you can be sure they're all aimed at Russia. And while, again, I can't prove anything, I believe that was a factor in Khrushchev backing down from Kennedy and agreeing to take the the missiles that they had installed in Cuba out. Can't prove it, but I believe it. And as far as my military experience goes, I'm more proud of that than anything else I've done there.
It's not often you can read the front page of the paper.
Oh, I have one more item I will share with you
ahead.
in regard to the military space program. About a year later, at a different base, I had an electronics modification crew, and we were going back into the finished silos and making some small mods on the launch equipment in the silo itself. While my crew was working in the equipment room, which is about 40 feet below ground level, I walked down an open tunnel that led from the equipment room to the silo. It was an open tunnel. And I stood there looking at that Minuteman at the side. And looking up, I couldn't see the top, but I knew that about 40 feet above my head, there was an atomic bomb. And that would cause you to have some serious reflection. My reflection was that thing goes off, I won't just be killed, I'll be obliterated. There'll be nothing left of me whatsoever if it were to go off while it's sitting under its concrete roof, and all the force would be directed back down into the silo, into the equipment room through that open tunnel. And you know something? I wasn't scared. It didn't bother me a bit. I had perfect confidence that it would not go off. Everything was under control, and I had nothing to worry about. But still, sitting there 40 feet from an atomic bomb is an awesome moment.
It's not often you can look at the front page of the newspaper and see that you have an influence on which direction events will proceed.
As I say, I can't prove it, but I like to think I had that influence, that I was a part. It was a group effort, obviously, but I like to think I had a part in that I contributed my share.
Those were scary days.
They were I believe, and I don't think there's much doubt about this, that was as close as the world has come to open atomic war. Well, Russia had missiles too. But in addition to our Minutemen, we had some Atlas vehicles already online. And I believe some Deltas, don't quote me on the latter, not positive, but I know we had some Atlas online with the warheads on top, also ready to fly. But the Atlas was a liquid propelled vehicle. You had to load all those liquid propellants first. And you had to go through a long checkout procedure, et cetera. Whereas the Minuteman, all you do is press a button and it flies. It's that easy. So, so the fact that we confronted Khrushchev at that point with what the missiles we had and the missiles he had, I am convinced that he knew what we had and backed down because of it.
Well, let's hope we don't get that close again.
Yes, it never again. We never want to be that close. Most people have no idea of the awful power of an atomic bomb. And I should mention, by the way, now this is something of which I have no proof, but I'm positive I'm right. They've gone back since then, the Air Force, and MIRVed all those missiles. MIRV means multiple reentry vehicles. And where there was once one atomic bomb on top of each missile, there are now three. That is pretty much the standard. I bet you every one of those 150 plus the other bases, which we built, quick side note, we built 6 Minuteman bases. 3 of them have been taken down because of the SALT agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And by coincidence, the 3 that on which I worked, which are in Montana, then South Dakota, and then North Dakota, those are the 3 that were left standing and are still in operation today. But those Minutemen still standing there and still ready to fire.
Wow. So you moved from the military space program over to NASA. Was there, did you have different jobs in between, or did you go straight from one to the other?
Well, I did not have a job in between. After I left Boeing, I did something I've been wanting to do for years, which is school. When I left home at age 18, I immediately got a job as a mill hand to help support my family. And then I married, as I mentioned earlier, at age 20. And after that, of course, I had a family. And so I basically was not able to do much other than work and support my family. As for how I got into NASA, that was a long road. I went to school for a year, went to college on savings. At the end of the year, my money was getting low and I had to go back to work. So knowing that the people were hiring here at the Cape, and I had the background experience would get me a job, I came here looking for a job. And again, my experience and background as an operations engineer and then a supervisor over missile installations got me a job very quickly, had no problems. And after 3 months, because I wasn't happy there, I got another job again, working both of these jobs called base support, meaning you're doing NASA's work. NASA contracts most of its work. They don't do most of it themselves. And then for the next 18 years, I worked for various contractors out of KSC while trying to get into NASA, which is where I really wanted to be. And after 18 years, I finally made it. And then I spent my last 13 years working directly for NASA. But before that, all the work I did supported NASA in some way or the other.
Okay. So tell us about what you did for NASA and for the contractors.
Well, I was a tech writer and at the lower levels of supervision throughout most of my career until I joined NASA. And I joined NASA, as you mentioned earlier, as a writer, the only one on the payroll. And I worked for the education office, and we did primarily documents, pamphlets, etc., semi-technical, that talked about what NASA did, what its programs were, all of the spacecraft we launched, what the vehicles were, et cetera, et cetera. We put those out for public consumption. Our operation also supported the NASA Public Affairs Office that handled the press. We had a specific group designed specifically for handling the press, and they used a great deal of the documents my unit in the education office produced in their ongoing endeavors. So, but primarily I worked as a writer, as I say, until I got into the lower levels of management, and that's where I finished out my career as Deputy Chief of the Education Office at the Kennedy Space Center.
You had some pretty high profile assignments during that time. I guess the one I would ask about is the Challenger report. I know that you were the editor that was in charge of that. It was terrible. I had I saw the explosion. I was looking in the right direction, driving down the road, right moment to look up and see the ship come apart, and it was devastating for someone that was hundreds of miles away and had no personal involvement with the effort. It must have been ever so much worse for you. Can you
I was standing outside the KSC headquarters building watching when it blew, and yes, one of the worst experiences of my life. But before we get to that, I want to mention one other thing I did in the civilian side of the space program, which I'm rather proud. On May 30th, 1966, I was a member of the launch team that sent an Atlas Centaur toward the moon. On that Atlas Centaur was the first Surveyor spacecraft. The Surveyor successfully landed on the moon and took thousands of photos of the lunar landscape that were helpful in planning for the Apollo mission that would send actual astronauts there later. Now, this was a group effort, of course, but I'm proud to say I was a member of the launch team that did that. Now, on to the Challenger and its loss. Yes, I was standing outside the headquarters building watching as that bird blew, and I couldn't believe it. In fact, I did not believe it. And I said, right, we had, as you know, the first teacher in space on that vehicle. And a friend of mine, Carl Christopherson, was standing by me. And I will never forget what he said, which was, "Oh no, not the teacher." Well, we went back inside the building then and watched it on TV as the story unfolded. And we learned from TV and the reports what had actually happened. And that was one of the saddest days of my life. But you asked about the Challenger report. I was the editor-writer of quite a bit of publications at that point in time and had something of a reputation. So the board they set up at KSC to invest, this was the NASA board that operated out of KSC. They drafted me to come be the editor for the report. I didn't have any choice in the matter, and I would have, and not that I wouldn't have been willing to, but I didn't have any choice in the matter. I was drafted and told to go there. I had two assistants, and myself and the two assistants basically did some writing, but primarily editing of what turned out to be, in the end, 52 thick volumes of a report on the loss of the Challenger. 52 thick volumes. A great many of those were photos. And so they occupied a lot of space without providing a lot of information, but also a great deal of it was text, engineering reports, et cetera, et cetera. And when we finished that Challenger report that we did became the basis for the national investigation ordered by the president, which then, issued, I'm sure you remember that commission that issued its own report. They used our report as the basis for the information they had, though they did conduct some investigations of their own. So yes, on the civilian side, being a member of the launch team on that Atlas Centaur Surveyor mission, and then the Challenger report were probably the two most important things I did in my years at NASA.
That I can't imagine how horrible that must have been to write that report.
It was grim work, but very necessary and very important. Oh, a quick item.
Sure.
As a member of the investigation group, although let's make clear here, I wasn't a member of the board which did the investigating. I was a worker who supported them. Well, nevertheless, as a member, I was allowed to go into the hangar area down in the vehicle assembly building, where they had assembled the remnants of the Challenger they had brought up from the ocean bottom. Now, they didn't bother to recover the solids. All that really mattered was the orbiter itself. They had reassembled the orbiter. So of all the pieces that had been recovered from the ocean, about 3/4 of the total was there. And I stood there in front of that ruined vehicle, 3/4 of it recovered, and thought about those 7 people who had died. That was another grim moment. But the report, as you say, was necessary, it was important, had to be done, and I did my job.
Tough job. During your time at NASA, I think that for most of fandom, you were the face of NASA to fandom. You gave personal tours, you did the most fabulous launch parties. They have become legendary. Can you talk a little bit? I don't know if you were, I guess you were evangelizing the program to fandom, or just sharing the joy that you had in it, but talk a little bit about your fan interactions during the NASA.
Okay, to some extent I was evangelizing, but basically I was just supporting. I didn't, the program at that point had become so popular it didn't need my particular support. But what happened was that I realized that I was the only science fiction writer in this area, and I was working out at the Kennedy Space Center. And it dawned on me that maybe some of my professional colleagues would like to see a launch in person. And so I decided that I would hold a little launch party, particularly for we held small parties for the two preceding launches. That's Apollo 8 and Apollo 10, where the astronauts went to the moon but did not land. And then we planned a big one for Apollo 11, where they were going to land. And anyway, I had started out saying this would be for my professional colleagues and science fiction writers of America. And I was going to hold that, except an unfortunate lapse of willpower. I violated what I told my family, and I invited 4 friends from New Orleans who were fans, not professional writers, to come to the launch. And that broke the dam. And then the rest of my family invited a great many other people. And so we had a horde of mixed fans and writers at the actual party. By the way, the party as such was only on the last night before the launch, but it was always a 3-day affair, which is standard time for most conventions, because we had people coming in, staying with us for all 3 days. And that included for those people who got credentials. And a quick side note, I told them how to get credentials, which isn't easy, but it's possible, which is go to your local paper, tell them that you will cover the launch for them for their standard rate of penny a word, most of them paid, and you'll pay your own expenses. For a local paper, that's a bargain, and most people take them up on it. And so a lot of people showed up here with credentials from the local paper, which entitled them to be part of the press. And as part of the press, they got to participate in the pre-launch activities NASA put on. And NASA puts on a 3-day show for a major man launch. They got to be part of the press and go on tours, see the bird from up close, all that, get lectures, et cetera, et cetera. So for the participants who had gotten their credentials, it was a 3-day affair. Well, in that 3-day affair, all of them that could crowd in were staying here at the greenhouse and sleeping here. And those that couldn't were sleeping wherever they could. But there's a small local motel we basically took over for most of the launches. There's so many of my people here. Rosie, my daughter, would abandon her room and go stay with a friend and turn her bedroom over to the guest. And we had people sleeping on bags in the living room because there was ran out of beds. And it was always for a 3-day affair when we always tried to keep on the table a loaf of bread or 2 and a large jars of mayonnaise and lots of lunch meat. And those who were hungry could always find something to eat. And boiled eggs. Oh, yes, boiled eggs, hard-boiled eggs. Yeah, so that went on for about 3 days. And during those times, let me tell you, I got very little sleep. From the time of the 3rd day from the launch until the actual launch itself, I got very little sleep. But we had a really great time, and we had a thoroughly enjoyable party. And I got to meet a great many people I hadn't met before throughout my many convention goings. For example, A.E. Van Vogt came to one of the launches. Joe and Gay Halderman were frequent guests. Sterling Lanier, who lived over on the other side of Florida, he didn't miss one. He wasn't that wild about launches, but he really enjoyed the parties. So he came and stayed for 3 days, time after time. And various other people. Paul Anderson came as often as he could. And one of the few times when he couldn't make it, Karen and Astrid came instead, and they just stayed with us and enjoyed the launch. And various others. Gordon Dixon was a frequent guest, again, came as often as he could. And they blend together after a while. There were so many after Apollo 11 because we had a pre-launch party for every single man launched to the moon. And it's hard to look back now and pick out very specific individuals and very specific events. But I can give you a few. I'll give you one highlight, for example. At one of the parties, Yevtushenko, very famous Russian poet, was brought here by an American compatriot that he knew. He was in the vicinity for the launch. And this compatriot brought him to our party. And he and Paul Anderson, we had just recently bombed Haiphong Harbor in Vietnam. And that was an escalation of the war at that time. And Yevtushenko and Paul Anderson got into a heated discussion about the war. Yevtushenko wasn't the least bit afraid to speak out just because he was visiting in an American's home. Anyway, he and Paul got into a heated discussion over the dining room table, and hearing it, I walked over and told both of them that this is not a political event. We're here to celebrate one of the great achievements of mankind, and we'd like to keep politics out of it. And they both quieted down, and we went on with the party. And about an hour later, Yevtushenko left. But anyway, it was great. It was one of the more memorable events, but there were so many others I couldn't possibly count them all. A.E. Van Vogt didn't go to very many conventions, and that was my only time I got to meet him. There were so many of the other pros here; it's hard to remember them all. Joe and Gay Haldeman, as they were frequent, and Paul as often as he could get here. Gordy Dixon, I'm not sure Gordy Dixon never missed one. He very much enjoyed them, and a great many other pros. I couldn't begin to name them all. And fans, oh gosh, they were legion. I couldn't begin to name them all either.
Name a couple. Name a couple. Boy, I wish I'd known you.
I could name a couple. How about Edie and Joe Clary? They were a couple.
No, we didn't come to the launch parties. The first time that we stayed with you for a launch was for Discovery a couple of years after Challenger, the first launch. That's Patrice told me that her secret for launch parties was to boil a lot of eggs, have a lot of hard-boiled eggs, because
have a lot of hard-boiled eggs available
always
for a quick
in the
snack.
morning.
Yes,
and you can send people off to the launch with a hard-boiled egg and a piece of bread. But no, these sound like they were just fabulous. When I was looking for materials to use in putting together the poster for this session, I kept coming up with descriptions of the launch parties that had been printed in fanzines when I searched on your name. So I think that legendary, that's the word. That's the word.
Sam Moskowitz was one of the famous.
My daughter asked me to reminded me that Chris Moskowitz was one of those people who came to lunch after lunch every time she could get away. And her husband, Sam, came to just one. He had by the time he'd lost his larynx and was using a mechanical device to speak. He came to only one of those. But there were other people who came to just one or two and no more than that. And then, as I said, the frequent people who loved them a lot came every time they could get away. It was pretty fabulous, but it wasn't just the party. It was the 2 days before that of the NASA presentations, and being a member of the press that allowed you a whole lot of privileges in regard to seeing the launch. That included, by the way, watching the launch from the Kennedy Space Center itself out at what they called the launch site. It was a series of steps outside where you could sit basically and watch the launch from a really good vantage point. And so if you had your credentials, seeing the launch was more than just the party. It was that whole 3-day event.
In the 80s, in addition to the launch parties, you were a mainstay of local Florida conventions, and you came down to Tropicon almost every year, and that was great. I wanted to ask you to tell a little bit about the Traveling Fete. The Traveling Fete was a relaxicon that we held in Florida, and it was unique in that we had one professional guest that was invited, and we expected the guest to do all the program. And so the first one that we did featured Joe Green. So Joe, tell us.
Oh, that was good, clean fun. Having the convention come to me instead of me going to the convention was a lot of fun. So I reciprocated by arranging a tour of the Kennedy Space Center for all the people who came from the Traveling Fete. And I took them out personally. At that time, I could have assigned someone, but I chose to do that personally. So I took all of you guys who were here for the Traveling Fete, and I did that tour myself. And it was a lot of fun. But I liked the Traveling Fete so much that after my turn was over, I went to a couple more throughout the state. Specifically, I remember going to Ben Bova's and one or two more, and they were always good, clean fun. I very much enjoyed them.
I don't think clean was really what we were looking for, but okay. You did a lot of private tours of KSC. One of the folks on the call now asked to join and cited that you had taken him and Katine and Terry.
I'm sorry, what was that name again?
It was Doug Font. Doug said that you had taken him and Katine and Terry. I don't know if that's Terry Carr or not, on a tour of the first shuttle launch. So could you say a few words about the private tours that you used to do? I can't imagine you had a weekend off because all the fans would be asking for it.
No, I did private tours usually for professional writers who were in the vicinity. I had enough authority by then that if I asked, the NASA people would let me do the tours. and I did quite a few. But when you say private tours, it means usually a few people involved. I did those as you personally and escorted them myself because I wanted to do the best I could for my fellow, usually professional writers. I did some for some English writers who were here, Jeff White and his buddy Bob, what's his name? Instead, they were here. I gave them a tour, and various others who were in the neighborhood at the time. Usually, they were going to be here doing something or the other anyway, and what I did was just arrange to be able to take them on a tour.
When you did the tour for the traveling vet, it really was a family affair. I know that you took us to places that were normally not open to the public, and so the moment I remember the most is when someone on the tour said, "How did you get the keys to let us into this room?" And you just waved the keys and said, "Because I always have these keys. They're on my key ring." And you
I'm sorry, I don't remember that specific instance.
That's
Edie.
okay.
I
That's
don't
okay.
remember it.
Never happened. Never happened. No one's in trouble.
Did I not take you guys out to the Cape and show you where we had the launch control center for that first American launch? I seem to remember doing that.
Uh-huh.
And that showed you the plaques where they had a dedication
Yes.
to Robert Goddard and also to, I believe it was, remember correctly, to Jules Verne. Anyway, plaques to early people who wrote some science fiction and also, as Robert Goddard did, experimented in the early rocket launches. And it's interesting to find those plaques to science fiction people inside the first launch control center for the first American successful launch of a space vehicle.
Good times back there. Okay, so you've been active for a long time and writing for a long time. Do you have some thoughts about the changes in the field from your early days to later time?
Yes, I'd like to talk about my personal metamorphosis,
Please.
if you can call it that, from the time that I began writing science fiction until much later when I was working in the real space program. When I began writing, I accepted most of the tropes of established science fiction, like FTL, aliens that looked just like us, except had long ears and high civilizations on other planets, et cetera, et cetera. I accepted all those tropes and I wrote stories and novels using those tropes. But as I got into the real space program, my view became much more realistic. And my view became that a lot of what I had written was in fact either unlikely or if not actually impossible. And that some of the tropes of science fiction were basically not yet and perhaps never will be available to us here in the real world. So my views changed. I began to write what I think of as more realistic science fiction based on real possibilities. And all my work over the last several years has been of that type. It isn't that I don't enjoy science fiction and fantasy. It's just that, as Sam Mine said once in an article, I believe in Startling, no matter how you slice it, dice it, or roboticize it, science fiction is in essence a subdivision of fantasy. Now, the only way that I can enjoy Star Wars, Star Trek, and all those other great TV series and movie series is to take the attitude that these are fantasy. And that way I can enjoy them. If I had to tell myself I believe this is all possible, it could all happen, that would take away all the enjoyment. So by basically making that mind shift, remember, I worked in the real space program for 37 years. So I got acquainted hands-on with the real world. And the real world and the aspirations of science fiction at its highest levels don't match very well. By taking the attitude, though, that this is fantasy, I could enjoy them, and I did, and I still enjoy them today. Star Trek above Star Wars, but that's a personal preference. Anyway, in today's world, I no longer read a lot of modern science fiction. And my best preferred science fiction is that which takes place here on Earth and explores future possibilities right here on Earth and explores societal changes or mechanical or technical changes that will affect us quite possibly or likely in the future as opposed to far-flung civilizations, beating aliens on distant worlds, et cetera, et cetera. That's all good, clean fun, but I no longer believe in it. So I prefer that which is located right here on Earth. The last novel I read was The Wind-Up Girl, which dealt with a whole lot of, let us say, highly advanced technology, but not in the rockets and spaceship area. And most of what I read today or write today is, again, based on the real world. One of my favorite new genres, which I've learned to like a lot, is alternate history. I've written several books now featuring alternate history. And that is something you don't have to believe in. It's just fun to write and enjoy. You may remember that Bring the Jubilee by Ward Moore was the first, I believe, established alternate history. It dealt with the Civil War ending differently in that the South won its independence and we became two nations here on this North American continent. And Bring the Jubilee is 100 years after the South won its independence and we had two nations. And it all goes on from there. But anyway, that became a very popular genre. Everybody does it these days. Greg Benford just recently did an alternate history. And you don't have to believe in it. It is a form of fantasy, but it's good, clean fun. And I've done several novels now in that category, which you'll find on my list at Amazon. I had to get in a plug there.
Oh, absolutely. Get all the plugs in. So you're still participating in fandom, whether it feels like it or not. I know you're involved in some communities online, and when I was in Florida, you certainly went to the conventions and all the rest. Do you have some thoughts on the evolution of fandom and the differences between your early days and now?
Well, I don't keep up with active fandom that much anymore. And I don't really feel qualified to speak on what fandom is like these days. What I keep thinking is that fandom is going to devolve, if that's the right word, or evolve, if you prefer, into more of an online community and less of a let's gather in all one place community. I think that is happening now, but it's a slow process. And so I think the world cons will go on for a while, but eventually I see them dissolving, not having them anymore. People just choose to meet online and avoid all that physical travel. But that's just me. I may be wrong. We will wait and see. In the meantime, I am on a list with, I think it's called a list, with quite a few other writers and fans, and where I go almost every day and check in, and we discuss this, that, and the other. It's oriented toward magazines, but they also get in a lot of other discussions. And I communicate with other people online, but not in a real major extent. I might as well tell you, I officially retired from active writing on my 91st birthday. I said, I've done this enough. At that point, I had either completed or in line where I'd done all the major work, 15 novels and 5 collections. 2 of those have still to be printed, but they're in work. My editor is working on those, and we will get them out probably both this year. And I chose to do what I've not had enough time to do throughout my working life, which is read more, what most of you do a great deal of already. And now I have the time, and I'm reading much more than I ever did when I was working all the time. And I also watch more TV than I ever did when I was working all the time. I'm relaxing. It's been I just had my 93rd birthday. I've had 2 years now of light labor. My editor pushed me to work now and then on various things, but light work, and I'm enjoying it hugely.
That sounds like a great retirement. So, Joe, here's the hard question. What did I not ask you that I should have asked you?
Not sure. I think we've covered pretty much my life. We didn't get much into my personal life. I mentioned that I've had 2 wives and raised 2 children with each. And that took a great deal of time and effort, and every bit of it was worthwhile. But my personal life is not really what we're about here. We're talking about my career and what I did in the real world that other people might know about. So I'm happy to leave it at that.
Okay. Okay, so I think we're getting to the questions part. So if folks on the Zoom, if you've got some questions, please put the word question in the chat, and we'll bring you online and let you ask. Okay, Fred Lerner has a question. Fred, I will highlight you. Please unmute yourself.
I read a book by a chap called Edward Tufte some years back. He's an information scientist specializing in graphic communication. And one of the points he made about the importance of thinking very carefully about how you present information had to do with graphs showing the temperature changes of an important component in the Challenger vehicle. And he argued that if the information had been presented in a more forthright manner, that they never would have approved launching the thing. Are you familiar with his argument? And if so, what do you think of it?
I am familiar with it, and I can't speak to the temperature bit, but what I can tell you, what we discovered, and I think now it's safe to talk about it, I wouldn't have talked about it earlier, was that the temperature in the air was so cold that launch day that the rubber O-rings, which are separate the two stages, the solid booster stages, they were so cold that they were not flexible enough. And when the fire burned down to the skin of the rocket, it actually burned through the skin then. And when it burned through the skin, then that sent a jet of flame into the propellant tank. And that jet of flame tore a hole in the propellant tank. And that caught the hydrogen on fire. And then, of course, the other side, the oxygen, spilled into it. And so you went from the tiny little bit of fire in just an instant to a conflagration. They called it an explosion. It really wasn't. It was an extremely rapid spreading fire caused by a highly combustible mixture of hydrogen and oxygen set off by a flame, because that the flame in the solid rocket had burned through the metal skin and then hit the propellant tank.
Thank you.
Surely.
Do we have any
Any
other
others?
questions? Yeah, Joe, any other questions for Joe? Okay, people are being shy. Joe, thank you. I think that it was lovely to have you at all those South Florida conventions, and it's wonderful to have you here and talk about your experience. Let me tell a story about Joe before we call it quits and give you guys a few more seconds for questions. My Joe and I were driving on a short vacation out of Florida. We left from South Florida and we stopped by Joe Green's house on the way to have a meal or spend an hour or so before we continued our escape from Florida, which took at least 8 hours to drive out of. We stopped to see Joe and Patty, and we ended up not leaving their living room for 3 days. We didn't get any chance to leave Florida. We didn't go anywhere. We just sat and talked endlessly for days on end. So Joe is a fabulous conversationalist as well as all the rest. We do have one more question from Rich Lynch. So let me put Rich on and let him ask it. Go ahead, Rich. Unmute yourself, please.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Lynch.
I'm good friends with Guy, who I'm sure is lurking nearby there.
He is nearby, yes.
Yeah, and hi to him. Anyway, I've heard stories about all the famous other writers you've met. I'm curious if you ever met Arthur C. Clarke.
Arthur C. Clarke was a personal friend. He used to come fairly often to the Kennedy Space Center. And the first few times he was here, we always had him over for dinner. So my daughter, who lived with me, who's sitting next to me here, she grew up meeting people like Clarke and Heinlein and thinking nothing of it. They were here all the time. Anyway, yes, Clarke was a personal friend, and I'm very, very sad that he died not that long ago, from my perspective.
We just put up some of the Interplanetary Society bulletins from the 30s, where he was the editor. So we've got some of his quasi-Spanish writings online too.
Oh, speaking of Clark, I can mention one thing I found fascinating. He had one of the best grasps of orbital mechanics of any writer in the business. I don't know where he got his education. It's just remarkable to me that he could do what he did. I took a course in orbital mechanics after I came to the Kennedy Space Center and learned a great deal I didn't know. I'd read a story by Clark a few years ago that dealt seriously with orbital mechanics, and the basic behind it was that a man whose spaceship goes awry saves himself with his leg power. The basic idea being that he put himself into a slightly different orbit as he was leaving the moon, so that he went into orbit around the moon instead of crashing back into it. And when I went back over that story after, as I say, taking a course in orbital mechanics, I learned that Clark had gotten it exactly right, and it was very detailed. And at the time I read it, I sort of shook my head and said, "Really? Is this the way it would be?" Well, it turned out, yes, he had it exactly right. And where did he get the education to come up with a story that features some fine detail on how orbital mechanics work and get it absolutely correct? I was just astonished. Clark was a remarkable man.
So, thank you, Rich. Joe also did a public service, at least I thought it was a service, a personal service, of introducing people to other people they might want to know. Joe knew that my Joe and I were Heinlein fans, and so he offered to introduce us to Virginia Heinlein, who was coming to dinner, or who he was meeting for dinner. And when he made that offer, I was in California on a business trip. So I took the red eye back and we motored on up so that we had the opportunity to meet Virginia Heinlein at through the kind offices of Mr. Green here. I'm sure you did that for many other people with many other well-known writers. And,
No, not really. Edie, you and Joe were always special. I just did that for you.
Thank you. Well then, anyways, it was a wonderful day, and it's the reason I want to go to Antarctica. Any other questions from anybody? Okay, Joe, I think we may be out of questions. You get off lightly today, but thank you so much for coming and spending an hour with us and telling us about the things you've done and the things you've seen and all the rest. It's a remarkable story.
It's been fun, and I particularly enjoyed being able to talk about my career in the military space program, where, as I said earlier, if I talked about it not that many years ago, I would have been visited by people I don't want to see. So I'm happy I had a chance to talk about it and make, I hope, some fans out there aware of what I did other than just write science fiction.